Alright, so in this video, this is your third and final installment of the series of videos I'm making for Authors of the Day to get us caught up so that we can begin Author of the Day with Cicero. And there are three more authors of what I like to term early Latin literature, and when you sit in my class and look to the right-hand side of the board, all of these authors are written in brown, because beginning with the first author after Lucilius, it is what we call the golden age of Latin literature, and you will be that Roman literature truly comes into its own, but I'll talk about that later. Our first guy of Author of the Day is Pacuvius. As you can see, not as important as some of the others we've had, and there's not that much you need to know for him, except that he wrote 37 tragedies. So unlike the new comedy of Plautus and Terence, Pacuvius, wrote tragedies. However, his most notable work is a Fabula Praetexta. Remember, that is a play based on Roman history titled simply Paulus. It is about a fellow named Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and gained the agnomen because he won the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC against the Macedonians, and so he gained the name Macedonicus. And that is by far, I think, his most notable work, and the one that you need to know. Pacuvius, however, is also noted because he is the nephew of Ennius, the father of Latin literature. And just like Ennius, he writes an Annales, that loosely translates as the yearlies, as it were. But that's all that you need to know for Pacuvius. He was a tragedian, but his most notable work, excuse me, is a Fabula Praetexta named Paulus, about the guy who won at Pydna, and he was the nephew of Ennius. The next guy, Accius. The only thing you need to know for Accius, for all intents and purposes, is as like Pacuvius, he is a tragedian, but his famous work is Brutus. The kings of Rome, 7 of them at the very beginning in the monarchy, at the founding, 753 BC to 510. The last king, the 7th king, Tarquinius Superbus, got out of line and abused his power, and so 2 men named Brutus and Collatinus were the ones who kicked out that final king. And that is that work, Brutus. Now, of course, Brutus is also the name of one of the 2 conspirators that hundreds of years later will lead the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar. And he was a descendant of this Brutus, and so he did that Brutus that assassinated Caesar in the conspiracy, thought that he was carrying on the family tradition, as Brutus had kicked out a king, and so did the Brutus that killed Caesar, thought that he was eliminating a king for Rome. And that's your first embedded item, Brutus, B-R-U-T-U-S, this Fabula Praetexta. Accius. Your third fellow is Lucilius, and he is the last of the early Latin literature guys in brown that I'll be writing on the board. Lucilius is the father and founder of Roman satire. What satire is essentially a investigation or a hard look at society and humanity, and in often a humorous, even sometimes a bitingly humorous way, pointing out the flaws of human beings. And what is unique about Lucilius is that his genre of satire is claimed by Quintilian as tota nostra, totally ours. Now, Quintilian is going to be an Author of the Day a couple of months from now. And Quintilian, as Author of the Day, is so incredibly important. He's living during the time at our Cornelians would be, in around the year 80 AD, is that he is a professor of public speaking, and he wrote a work called the Institutio Oratoria, in which he, in the 10th and final book of that, goes through all of Latin literature that we have, and we are so thankful that he does, because so much stuff is not extant, it's not around, but he comments on it, stuff that is not around anymore and stuff that we do have that is extant. And when he talks about the genre of satire, he refers to it as tota nostra, completely ours. Now, Lucilius, as the father of satire, is not going to be Mr. Satire. Mr. Satire is going to be the last of the satire authors. Varro, Horace, Persius, Juvenal will be Mr. Satire, but his influence is incalculable due to the fact that obviously he's the one that has it blossom and expand as a uniquely Roman genre. The other thing that you need to know for Lucilius is that Lucilius was a part of the Scipionic Circle. Remember that group of authors that Terence belonged to. A third guy that I often like to bring up and let you know was a Greek author, and he had this Greek author really as a hostage, but more so as a friend. Now, it's hard to think of in that ways, but what you would do in the ancient Roman world is that to make sure that whatever kingdom, or make sure that whatever people that you have conquered stays in line and will not revolt, is that you will take some very important and very valued people, and those folks will be held hostage by you. Now, you will treat them well. You will obviously often even act as though that they are your friends, and you become friendly with them. But essentially they are insurance that if that kingdom or whatever place it had been gets out of line, you execute them. It's to ensure that there's not a revolution or a revolt or whatever it might be. And Scipio, the great fellow who was again the adopted grandson, Aemilianus Scipio, of the fellow who defeated Hannibal, but this Scipio, the Aemilianus one, was the one who destroyed Carthage in the Third Punic War. He had with him, along with Lucilius, along with Terence, Polybius, a Greek historian that we will come to learn later is invaluable because he gives us a history of Rome, and it is so important to have a view of a Rome and its history from a non-Roman because it gives us the advantage of an unbiased outsider kind of looking in. And so those are your three members of the Scipionic circle. That would be, of course, Terence, that would be Lucilius, that would be Polybius. There are others, obviously, but those are the three that I want you to be familiar with. Now, you, at this point, are going to enter into what we call the Golden Age of Latin literature. Now, as the Golden Age of Latin literature, it is going to be a point in which Latin literature truly does come into its own as a viable expression literarily. And the beginning of this Golden Age, we give it the year 106. And the reason why is because that is the birth of a fellow who will come to dominate, and I mean dominate, a certain part of this Golden Age. And his fellow's name is Marcus Tullius Cicero. Now, from 106 all the way down to 31, we call this section of the Golden Age the Ciceronian Golden Age. And then after that, you have Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, from 31 BC to 14 AD, and we call that the Augustan Golden Age. Well, first we deal with the Ciceronian Golden Age, and that time period corresponds, whenever I draw my greater timeline of ancient Rome, what I like to call the higgliness and piggliness. All of the civil wars, all of the strife. At the very first day of school that you're in my class, I talk about the roster, the murder list, and how Sulla, the dictator, had put that murder list on the speaker's platform. All of it is in the midst of this. Here, right here at 44 BC is the assassination of Julius Caesar. Just utter, complete chaos and instability. And Cicero is going to be at the heart of it all, and that is why we call it the Ciceronian section. So, very quickly, to get us to Cicero, we have these first three authors of the Ciceronian Golden Age. The first is Marcus Terentius Varro. He is a polymath. A polymath is a person who is expert in a wide variety of things or subjects. And Quintilian, that same fellow, we always like to talk about Quintilian and talk about how he comments upon these authors, called him the most learned, the most erudite of all Romans. He was a contemporary of Cicero, he lived during the time of higgliness and piggliness, and he was a literary scholar. And just look at the list of things that he authoritatively, he expertly wrote about. He wrote history, he wrote geography, he wrote rhetoric, that is public speaking, he wrote law, he wrote philosophy, he wrote music, he wrote on medicine, he wrote architecture, he wrote literary history, he wrote religion, he wrote agriculture, and he wrote language. He was prodigious. He is credited with writing over 620 works in his life. But only two survive. Only two are extant, and these are they. The De Lingua Latina, which is merely a treatise. A treatise is like an essay on steroids. It's much longer and much more in-depth than an essay on the Latin language. De Lingua Latina, and his other work is a farming treatise called De Re Rustica. And so there it is with Varro. All you need to know for Varro is that he's a polymath. He writes a whole bunch of stuff on a whole bunch of things. And unfortunately for us, the two things that are extant that you need to know is the De Lingua Latina and, of course, the De Re Rustica. That is the second item that you need to have embedded is going to be Varro himself. V-A-R-R-O, the polymath. Now, our last two authors, before we get to Cicero, and you can see when I scroll as to how important he is, oh, look at the font, are going to be Hortensius and Nepos. But first, Hortensius. Hortensius Hortalis, we just call him Hortensius, was the leading advocate, the leading jurist of the day until Cicero arrives, and he was Cicero's rival in the courts. And that's really all you need to know for him. However, the other thing that you might need to know is when we get to the author Catullus, we know that the 65th poem of the Carmina, the 116 poems that we have from Catullus, the 65th is addressed to Hortensius, and Catullus says to Hortensius, "I'm so sorry that I cannot write this poem that you've asked. Please take some of these translations of Callimachus, a Greek poet, instead." And the great funny irony that is there is that obviously he's writing a poem saying he can't write a poem. But what you need to know for Hortensius is that he is the great rival of Cicero. He is the greatest advocate in Rome until obviously Cicero himself arrives. The second of the third of the Golden Age authors that finally get us to Cicero is going to be that of Cornelius Nepos. He is a biographer, and he is the first Latin biographer. He corresponded with Cicero, oh, is Cicero so important, and he wrote a biography of a whole bunch of people, including Cicero's BFF, Atticus. And aren't we so glad that Cicero and Atticus were BFFs? We'll learn why that is the case when we eventually get to Cicero. The other thing you need to know for Cornelius Nepos, besides that he is a biographer, and by the way, he will not be Mr. Biographer, that is a title that will go to someone else, is that he, Nepos, is the person to whom that whole set of poems that I talked about Catullus earlier, called the Carmina, literally the songs or the poems, the whole of it, the very first poem, is dedicated to Cornelius Nepos, that biographer. And so those are your three guys that are the first three of the Golden Age, the Ciceronian Golden Age. You have the polymath, which is that of Varro. You have Hortensius, the great rival in the courts before the arrival of Cicero. And you have Cornelius Nepos, whose name is the word in Latin for grandsons, where we get the term nepotism, the giving of jobs and or favors to those that are in your family, as it were. So your third and final item to put in for this video quiz is merely going to be the name of Nepos, N-E-P-O-S, the great biographer who was an acquaintance to Cicero. And so that means that now we will begin in class, in person, our author of the day, Cicero. And it's going to take me more than just a day, I think, with him, because, of course, of how important he is and all the sorts of things that he had written. So that is it again. Remember, our authors are the last few of the early Latin literature, Pacuvius, Accius, Lucilius, and then, of course, Varro, Hortensius, and Nepos. And that last item that you have embedded is Nepos itself, N-E-P-O-S. So hopefully you will enjoy the author of the day, and we'll be able to begin with the man himself, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Thank you.